I grew up in a suburban area of Oregon, where dense pine forests surrounded me, and small dirt roads led deep into the woods. It was a quiet place, too quiet that sometimes it felt like I was isolated from the outside world. The familiar sounds of city life never appeared here. Only the rustling wind through the trees and occasionally the incessant chirping of insects at night. I always felt like I didn't really belong in this place. As soon as I graduated and saved enough money to move to a larger city, I left without looking back. But this story takes place when I was still a child. At that time, my family lived on a wide plot of land, nearly 6 acres, surrounded by trees and a few small streams flowing through. Our house was quite small, nothing special, but it was completely isolated from anything else. Not far from the main house was an old barn that had long ceased to be used for its original purpose. It was just a place to store old things that my dad never touched anymore. I was 12 years old when this happened, and it was an ordinary weekend day like any other. My parents were often away because of their business, and they trusted me enough to stay home alone, so I wasn't worried at all. That afternoon, the sky was overcast as usual for autumn. Dark grey clouds rolled in, casting a gloomy hue over the entire space. I sat on the sofa, playing Tony Hawk's Pro Skater on the old Xbox. The house was eerily quiet, with only the sounds of the game and the occasional gust of wind rustling through the trees outside. Suddenly, a metallic noise rang out from the back of the house, startling me. The sound was like someone dragging something across the yard. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking it might just be the wind. But then I heard another noise, this time clear and louder, coming from behind the barn. I stood up and looked out the window. There was nothing unusual in the front yard. But when I glanced toward the barn, I noticed something strange. The barn door, which was always securely locked, was now wide open. It wasn't just slightly ajar. It was completely swung open, as if someone had just walked inside. A sense of unease welled up inside me. I had watched many horror movies, and instinctively I knew this was not a good sign. But instead of calling the police right away, I convinced myself that maybe the door had just been blown open by the wind. Still, to be safe, I went into my parents' bedroom and retrieved the handgun my dad always kept hidden in the drawer. He had taught me how to use it, even though I had never thought I would actually have to use it. With the gun in hand, I opened the back door and stepped outside. The cold air and the smell of damp earth hit my nose. I walked slowly, trying to make no noise as I approached the barn. The tension made my heart race faster. Standing in front of the open door, I yelled, "Is anyone in there?" My voice trembled, and the silence that followed only heightened my anxiety. I held my breath, listening intently. But there was no reply, only the sound of the wind rustling through the old, rusty door. I didn't dare step inside. It wasn't that I was entirely afraid. My instincts told me that something was off. I quickly retreated, locked the barn door, and ran back to the house. Once inside, and securely locking the door, I sat down on the sofa, trying to calm myself. The Xbox game was still running, but I couldn't focus on playing anymore. I felt uneasy, as if someone was watching me from somewhere in the darkness. I decided to call my dad, but he didn't answer. I left a message and then sat still, trying to focus on the TV to forget the growing anxiety in my heart. Another sound echoed this time, not from the shed but from upstairs. The creaking noise, as if someone was moving in my bedroom. My heart tightened. I knew I was home alone. Who could be upstairs? The feeling of fear froze me for a moment. But then I gathered my courage, gripped the gun tightly, and made my way up the stairs. I moved slowly, hearing every breath I took, As I neared the top of the stairs, I turned on the hallway light. The dim light illuminated the row of bedrooms. There were 5 doors, 4 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. All of them were closed. The creaking sound echoed again from my bedroom. I stepped closer and looked through the crack under the door. Nothing. But just as I was about to turn away, the door slowly opened, and I heard a deep voice say, "Hello." The voice was cold, unfamiliar, and seemed to come right from behind the door. I felt as if the blood in my veins was freezing. I don't know who is in my bedroom, but clearly someone is. Instead of confronting them, I turned and ran down the stairs. I didn't stop until I was in the kitchen and locked the door behind me. My heart was pounding as I called 911. The dispatcher reassured me, telling me to stay calm and not do anything dangerous. Finally, the police arrived. They searched the entire house but found no trace of an intruder. Everything remained silent. The windows were still tightly shut. They told me that perhaps I had misheard or imagined it due to the stress of being alone. But I knew what had happened. Someone had entered my house. And the most frightening thing wasn't that person's presence, but the deep, raspy voice. A cold and unfamiliar voice, as if it had haunted my house for a long time, just waiting for the chance to appear. From that day on, I never dared stay home alone again. It was a cold winter in Colorado, and I had just moved into a small wooden cabin on the outskirts of town to live temporarily for a few months while waiting for a new job. The house was nestled deep in the woods, far from any residential areas, but I felt quite fine with that. Living alone amidst nature sounded relaxing and healthy after years of stressful work in the city. I had always enjoyed the quiet and fresh air of the wilderness. One night, after cleaning up from dinner, I decided to go for a walk to enjoy the fresh air. Winter here was harsh, but the clear sky and the moonlight reflecting off the snow created a shimmering scene. As soon as I stepped out the door, a gust of cold air enveloped me. I adjusted my scarf and started down the trail that led away from the house. After walking about a few dozen meters, I suddenly heard a strange sound behind me. It was the sound of footsteps, very light but unmistakable on the snow. My heart raced, and I turned around to look. There was no one there. I tried to calm myself, thinking it was just the sound of falling snow or a small animal scurrying by, but the uneasy feeling clung to me. I decided to stop and head back home. The next morning, I woke up to a thick layer of snow covering the yard and trees around me. I didn't think much about the incident from the previous night, and continued my day working on the computer. My job allowed me to work remotely, giving me plenty of time to enjoy life surrounded by nature. In the afternoon, I went outside to take out the trash. As soon as I opened the front door, I saw footprints pressed deep into the snow, leading from the forest straight to my front door. These weren't animal tracks. They were unmistakably human. A chill ran down my spine. I began to feel anxious. Maybe these were just the footprints of someone passing by, but who would wander deep into the woods just for a stroll in the middle of winter like this? I tried to reason with myself, to find a logical explanation, but I couldn't shake the growing sense of fear welling up inside me. A few days later, around 7 p.m., I was getting ready to go out and buy some essential supplies. By then, it was completely dark, and the snow had started to fall heavily. I quickly put on a thick coat, pulled on my wool hat, and stepped outside toward my car. As I stood there, I heard footsteps again. This time, the sound was very close, as if someone was standing just a few meters away. I turned my head, but all I could see was darkness, cloaked by the falling snow. It felt as though someone was watching me, but I couldn't pinpoint where or who. My heart raced, and I hurriedly opened the car door, driving straight onto the road without stopping to think. As I drove into town, I wondered if I was imagining things. Maybe living alone for so long was causing my mind to play tricks on me, making me think of things that weren't really there. Even so, I couldn't shake the chill I felt when I heard those footsteps. I decided not to stay at the house alone that night. After buying what I needed, I stopped by Julia's place, a former colleague and close friend from college. She lived in an apartment near the town center. When I told her about what had happened, Julia advised me to contact the police, or at least have someone come by and check around my house. But I brushed it off, thinking there was nothing to worry about. It was just a coincidence, I tried to convince myself. However, things didn't stop there. On another night, when I returned from town, I noticed something strange on the living room window. A faint imprint of someone's face, as if they had pressed their face against the glass from the outside to peer in. Fear surged through me, and for the first time, I truly felt threatened. I decided to call the police. When they arrived, they checked around the house but found no other traces except for the old footprints, now mostly covered by snow. They suggested that it was probably just a stranger passing by, but reassured me that if I felt unsafe, I could request more frequent patrols in the area. I started to feel confused and considered moving somewhere else, but the thought of packing up and relocating in the middle of winter made me hesitate. I reassured myself that everything would be fine, and perhaps I was just overreacting. Yet deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The final incident happened one evening when I had just returned from a short trip. As I parked in front of the house, I saw a figure standing silently under the tree near the front door. He wore a long black coat, a hat, and a mask. My heart seemed to stop. I didn't know what to do. He didn't move closer, nor did he run away. He just stood there, staring at me. In that moment of terror, I rushed back into the car and locked the doors tightly. I tried to call the police, but my hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped my phone. When I looked back, the figure had vanished, leaving no trace behind. The police arrived shortly after, but they found nothing. They suggested I stay with someone else for a few days, and that became my final decision. I packed my things and left that house the very next morning. I didn't know who that person was or why they were watching me, but I didn't want to find out. After moving to an apartment in the city center, I felt safer. But sometimes, when night falls and I'm alone, I can still hear the echo of footsteps in my mind, a cold, haunting sound that I will never forget. On an early autumn evening, when I was home alone in a small house on the outskirts of a quiet town in Ohio, the sky was just beginning to darken. I had planned to spend the night watching movies and playing games. The house was isolated, next to a small forest, and my entire family was away due to work. At that time, I was 17 years old and someone who enjoyed peace and quiet. It wasn't the first time I'd been home alone, but as the night settled in, there was a strange feeling. Everything around me seemed vague and full of mystery. I was sitting on the couch, playing my favorite FPS shooter game, when the doorbell rang. The sound startled me. This area rarely had visitors, especially late in the evening. I glanced at the clock. It was just past 8, but it was already pitch dark outside. I got up and walked over to the window to look out front. The dim streetlight cast a faint glow on the path leading to the house, but no one was there. A strange feeling crept into me, but I told myself that maybe someone had just rung the bell by mistake. I went back to the couch, intending to continue playing, but just a few minutes later, the doorbell rang again. This time, I couldn't brush it off as easily. I walked to the front door and called out, "Who's there?" There was no response. Curious and a bit uneasy, I cracked the door open slightly and saw a man standing a short distance away. In the faint glow of the streetlight, he looked disheveled, his clothes messy, and his eyes locked onto mine with an unsettling intensity. "Sorry, do you need something?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. The man smiled, but it was a forced, unnatural smile. "I'm lost. Could I come inside and borrow your phone to make a call?" he asked. He stood still, not approaching, but also showing no intention of leaving. His voice was raspy, as if he had been talking too much throughout the day. I didn't want to let a stranger into the house, so I replied, "I can make the call for you, but I can't let you come inside." He paused for a moment, his eyes still locked on me, before turning away. I closed the door, but before I could step back, loud knocking suddenly erupted. This time, it wasn't the soft doorbell, it was heavy, urgent banging. Something felt wrong. A vague fear rose inside me as I stepped back, trying to take deep breaths. But the knocking didn't stop, and then a different voice came from outside.
"Please help me."
I went back to the window to look, and this time I saw an older woman standing on the walkway. She was wearing a thick, worn coat, and in her hand, she was clutching something. In the dim light, I couldn't make out exactly what it was, but the situation was becoming more unsettling.
"I need help. Could you let me in?"
Part of me wanted to open the door and help her, but my instincts warned me that something wasn't right. The uneasy feeling made me hesitate. In the end, I decided not to open the door. "I'm sorry, I can't let anyone in right now. If you need help, I'll call the police for you." The woman stood there silently for a moment, then suddenly turned away and disappeared into the darkness. I didn't dare watch her go. I just stood there, feeling like I had narrowly escaped a very unsettling situation. I returned to the sofa, but I no longer felt like playing the game. The questions kept echoing in my mind. Why did they show up so mysteriously? And what did they really want? I couldn't answer those questions, but I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe they were just lost and genuinely needed help. After a while, I started to feel a bit more at ease. But then, from the window next to me, a faint sound caught my attention. It was soft, but just loud enough to make me notice. A scratching sound, like someone tapping on the glass with something sharp. I shot up, my heart pounding in my chest. The uneasy feeling was no longer just a passing thought. I knew someone was outside. I tiptoed toward the window and carefully pulled the curtain back just a little. And then I saw a sight I would never forget. The man from earlier was standing right outside the window, holding a large knife. The blade was scraping against the glass, producing that chilling sound. His eyes locked directly onto mine through the window pane. I immediately closed the curtain, trying to stay calm, but panic flooded over me. I rushed to the living room, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911. The ringing felt like it lasted forever as I pressed my back against the wall, trying not to breathe too loudly. When the operator finally answered, I quickly explained my situation, my voice trembling as I reported the man outside with the knife. The police arrived after about 15 minutes, but the man had already disappeared without a trace. They checked the area around the house, but found no one and no signs of a break-in. They advised me to stay cautious and promised to patrol the neighborhood. After the police left, I couldn't return to a normal state of mind. Even though they didn't find anyone, I knew for certain that someone had intentionally tried to frighten me. I stayed awake the entire night, eyes glued to my phone, listening intently to every little sound coming from outside. The next morning, I told my family the whole story, and my parents agreed that I should avoid staying home alone for a while. I didn't know if that man would ever come back, but from that day on, every time I heard the slightest sound outside the window, my heart would race faster than usual. My home is in a small town in the central United States, where long roads stretch out and green hills roll across the landscape. My sister, Lily, and I lived in an old two-story Victorian-style house. The house has 2 kitchens, one on each floor, giving each of us our own space. Lily usually spends most of her time at her boyfriend's place, about 30 miles away from our home, so I often find myself alone in the house. Even though I'm 30 years old, being alone sometimes still makes me uneasy. One night, with the street lights casting their glow through the windows, I decided to enjoy a horror movie. Our living room has an open design, connected to the dining room and kitchen, creating a spacious yet dark atmosphere. I sat on the sofa in the middle of the room, my back facing the front door. With only the faint light from the TV, the darkness enveloped the rest of the house, making me feel uncomfortable. Every time I heard a small sound, I'd turn around, feeling as if someone was standing right behind me. When the movie ended, I turned off the lights and went to bed. But just 2 hours later, I woke up at 1 a.m., unsure why. In the stillness of the night, a voice echoed from downstairs. I listened carefully and realized it was my sister, Lily's voice. It sounded like she was calling me from below, but it wasn't a cry for help. I thought maybe she was arguing with her boyfriend, but in my half-awake state, I couldn't be sure. I rubbed my eyes and decided to get out of bed, filled with curiosity. I turned on the hallway light and began descending the stairs. My sister's voice called out again, this time clearer, saying my name. I grew more puzzled, unsure of what was happening. As I approached the bottom of the stairs, a sense of anxiety crept over me. I called out loudly, "What's going on, Lily?" As I got closer, I couldn't find the light switch at the entrance to the lower floor. I saw a faint glow coming from the living room, but no one was there. Quietly, I stepped into the kitchen, which was usually our cozy space. At that moment, the light in the kitchen began to flicker slowly, but all I could see was thick darkness surrounding everything. I searched every corner, but Lily was nowhere to be found. I stepped into her room and called out her name again, but there was no response. Just as I spoke, a sudden sound came from her room, as if something had fallen onto the floor. Goosebumps crawled over my skin, and fear surged through me. In a panic, I hurried back to the stairs, ran to my room, and shut the door tightly behind me, feeling like a frightened child hiding from the darkness. I tried calling my sister on the phone, but there was no response. Wondering if I had imagined everything, I decided to calm myself and convinced myself that it must have been just a dream. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep again. The next morning, as the first sunlight streamed through the window, I woke up to a message from my sister. She asked why I had called her at 1 a.m. I asked if she had come home last night, and she replied that she had been at her boyfriend's place. A chill ran down my spine. Determined to figure out what had happened, I went downstairs to check on everything from the night before. When I entered her room, nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of unease clung to me. I searched everywhere, looking for any sign of the strange events from the night before. Everything was quiet, but there was still a lingering sensation, as if someone or something was watching me. I decided to step outside for some fresh air, hoping to shake off the strange feeling. Yet, the sounds from that night still echoed in my mind. After returning home, I tried not to dwell on it too much, but the cold wind and the darkness outside made it impossible for me to fall asleep easily. A week later, when Lily returned home, I decided to tell her about the strange experience. As I recounted the events, she suddenly became serious.
A while ago, I heard someone calling my name in the middle of the night too. I thought it was you.
Lily said, her eyes filled with uncertainty. I don't know what to think anymore. Is there something strange happening in this house? I shuddered, too unsettled to say more. We decided to check all the locks again, making sure no one unwelcome was around. The feeling of unease lingered as we inspected every corner, hoping to find reassurance, but instead deepening our sense of dread. Even though we found no signs of anything unusual, the feeling of unease refused to leave me. Together, we decided to perform a cleansing ritual to clear the energy in the house, praying that nothing evil could invade our living space. After the ceremony, the atmosphere in the house felt lighter, more peaceful, but the memories of that strange voice still lingered, haunting my mind. As time passed, the memory of that night never faded. I started noticing strange signs around me, but I couldn't tell if it was just my imagination or if something real was happening. Sometimes, late at night, when everything was quiet, I would hear faint whispers, but I never dared to look out the window. We decided to move after a short time, as the feeling of unease had lingered for far too long. But one thing I will always remember: in the darkness, there are things we cannot explain, and sometimes, the voice of a loved one may come from places we cannot see. When I was a child, I lived in a small suburban town in the northern United States. My mother was a single parent, and her job often required her to work night shifts to support the family. My older brother had already gone off to college, so I was frequently home alone in the evenings. Though I sometimes felt lonely, I had grown accustomed to taking care of myself. One weekend night, while my mum was working the night shift, I decided to invite my close friend Sarah over. We spent the evening watching comedies and laughing together. However, as it got late, my mum called to remind me not to let Sarah stay too long. Reluctantly, I walked her to the door, and she left around 10 p.m., leaving me alone in the big, quiet house. After she left, I felt a bit empty. Our house had an open design, with the living room connected to the kitchen and dining area. I sat back down to watch a horror movie on TV, but the light from the screen couldn't dispel the loneliness and the silence that enveloped the house. The house seemed even larger when I was alone. As the movie played, I suddenly heard a strange noise coming from the back of the house. I stood up and walked toward the window to check. When I looked out, I saw a figure sitting on the patio chair in the backyard. In the darkness, I couldn't make out his face, but I had the unsettling feeling that he was staring directly at me. Suddenly, I remembered the stories my mum used to tell about strangers showing up at night. My heart pounded, and a wave of fear washed over me. Sarah? I called out my friend's name, but there was no response. It had only been about 10 minutes since Sarah left, so I thought maybe she had come back. But as I looked more closely, I realized it wasn't anyone I knew. My heart seemed to stop, and I quickly turned away, pulling the curtain shut and switching off the TV. In the darkness, I sat, curled up on my bed, hugging my knees tightly, barely daring to breathe. I waited in the darkness, too afraid to turn on my phone for fear that the light might attract the stranger's attention. All I could hear were faint noises from the yard, like the sound of a chair being moved. Time seemed to stand still, but I felt like about 5 minutes had passed. Finally, a surge of courage welled up inside me, and I decided to get up and check one more time. I slowly approached the window, and a wave of terror washed over me when I saw that the man was still sitting there, staring up at my window. Instead of running, I took a deep breath and asked, "What do you want?" There was a hint of recklessness in my voice. The man didn't reply, but instead began to chuckle softly. At first there was no sound, but then I heard a wheezing noise. Like he was laughing so hard he couldn't catch his breath. I couldn't bear it any longer and quickly turned away. Returning to my bed, I felt paralyzed, unsure of what to do. For some reason, I couldn't bring myself to call 911, even though fear was suffocating me. I decided to leave my room and sit on the stairs, trying to listen for any sounds near the back door. That's when I heard a knocking sound, like someone was trying to open the door. Fear overwhelmed me, and I sprinted back to my room to hide. I was only 14 years old, and I had no idea what to do in a situation like this. After a while, I heard noises coming from the front door, like the man was trying to force it open. My heart stopped at the thought of him getting inside. But after what felt like an eternity, the sounds stopped. Relief washed over me as I realized he had given up. I rushed to the window, locking it tight and pulling the curtains closed. My heart was still pounding as I replayed the terrifying situation in my mind. I didn't dare leave my room again until my mum came home around 9 p.m. When she walked in, I hurriedly told her everything that had happened. Instead of worry, her reaction was anger.
Why didn't you call 911?
She asked, her voice filled with disappointment. Looking back, I realized it had indeed been a mistake. I was just a kid, unsure of how to react in such a frightening situation. 4 days after, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. It felt as though a shadow was still watching me. I didn't dare go into the yard alone, and I always double-checked the front and back doors before going to bed. The feeling of insecurity clung to me for a long time, making it hard to feel safe again. A week later, I decided to share my story with Sarah. I knew that if I didn't talk about it, it would haunt me forever. As I recounted the events of that night, her expression grew serious.
I think I heard something strange last week too. I didn't tell anyone because I was afraid they'd think I was crazy.
We decided together not to let fear take control of our lives. Yet, every time we heard an unusual sound from outside, the fear would return. We never found out who that stranger was, but one thing was certain. We would never forget the feeling that night had brought. The sense that there are things in this world we cannot understand or control, and sometimes the shadows in life are always waiting, ready to fill us with fear.